God. Yeah, upper left afterwards. Come by if you want to hang out and talk more data. We're PDX Data. We host these monthly in conjunction with the data science group as well. Future of this particular meetup is unknown, so more to follow. I'll announce things on Slack and also in the meetup group as we figure out what's going on. Quick questions. Who here is new to PDX Data Science Group? Feel free to count if you want, Scott. Who is new, first time being in a meetup in New Relic? Great, welcome all of you. I'll thank the different flavor of speech to many people. So without further ado, this is Joe Toscano. Yes, got it. Ex-Go consultant, currently doing experience design consulting. Take it away.
A lot of feedback. Yeah, so he said, my name is Joe Toscano. I, for the past year, spent my time consulting for Google as a experience designer. Right now, my current project is that I'm writing a book called Designing Intelligence, which is, as we'll kind of get into, design thinking approach to the future of computing, the era of ambient computing, where everything around us is sensing the world that it is in. It's reading these things, it's monitoring the data, and it's making things work automatically. And how do we conceptualize essentially like human-computer interactions within this future world that we're going to be going into? So that's what I'm going to walk through with you tonight. Is we're going to walk through a little bit of history and how we even got here, because I've found that a lot of us, it's tough to keep up with what's happening in the tech world today. There's so much going on, and we're all so busy that sometimes it's tough to like really think about how we even got here in the first place and why things are happening the way they are. So we'll walk through a little bit of history, understand why conversation is going to probably be the future of how we interact with these systems, and then walk through how to design the systems. After we do that, we'll kind of talk about how it plays a role in the larger systems at large, and how this can play out in the future. So we'll start off with the history, talk about data, technology, evolution, how they've all kind of played together, and how we can really, instead of thinking about, I think a lot of us think about data as like the binary or a data point in a database, things like that. We can actually think of data as information that's been stored and is accessible for archive or research later time. So going way, way, way back. Well, first we'll start off with like why data has spurred evolution. So the reach of data, the ability of information to go far, to reach different places in the world, helps it spread faster. The specificity, the context of data and information. So we're having a conversation right now. If you don't know the words coming out of my mouth, it's meaningless, right? So the specificity of one-to-one conversation matters in the value that you get from the data. The permanence and the organization of it, the ability to go back and find it, right? As we'll walk through, like that's not always been the case, but now everything is very permanent and recorded and very easy to find because it's organized. And then the speed of dissemination. How fast does word travel? So we started off one-to-one human-to-human interactions. Data at this point was conversation. It was words that came out of our mouth. It was the first time when we had language. It was the first time we could take a thought, a completely intangible, meaningless thing, and transfer it to someone else's brain. Right? We do stuff like that with computers nowadays, with Wi-Fi and Bluetooth, but we did this between human beings before any technology, as like the modern world understands it, was ever created through language. We did this for millions and millions of years. The specificity of these interactions was incredibly high because we were one-to-one all the time, or maybe small groups, but we generally understood each other's language. We had a history with the person we were talking to, probably. We still have this, but you could make inside jokes, you can make historical remarks, things that people understood, and that's the specificity. But permanence was not good, right? Permanence, as soon as the words came out of my mouth, it was gone. Organization in that sense was very tough too, and the speed of things to reach different places took times, and knowledge was passed by storytelling through generations. So evolution took more time in that sense, right? If that person died off, then that knowledge had to be relearned and re-architected. As time went on, we got into more organized communities, villages. You might have had flyers at this point, written language, so things were a little bit more permanent. You had a bit greater reach because you might have town halls, things like that. But specificity in general was not that much better. Reach was not that much better. Things didn't change a ton. But this took us millions of years to get to these tribes, these larger organized communities. When we reached the era of the Gutenberg press, so how many of you know what the Gutenberg press is? Okay, good. A lot of you do. I've had some audiences that don't know what that is. But this was the first time that we had a very strong increase in permanence, right? Like we could take information and print it, we could scale it very easily. And as we created libraries and sources of books, it was more organized. Something a lot of people don't think about as well is that what this did, we recreated Bibles, was the first thing that was printed, took the Word of God out of the church. People could then study religion outside of church and make their own opinion. This control of information was then disseminated to the world, and we saw wars because of source of information itself, data. We get into telecommunications, and now we're reaching around the world. So our reach is just incredibly far. The speed is much faster. The permanence is much greater as we get into TV, recorded audio, things like that. Everything is getting recorded more and more. Then we get into the internet, and now we're seeing great diversity in these populations too, right? It's not just around the world, but anyone can find this. And things are just stored on the internet. Anyone can go find it. The context at this point is about the lowest it's going to get in the history of mankind. Anyone can go find it. We don't know who they are. We don't know what their background is. They just can go find this information. But it's out there. It's stored. It's more permanent. Everything's getting tracked. Now we've entered an era of more targeting. So we're grouping based on demographics. Specificity is growing again. It bottomed out, but it's going back up. Everything else is kind of peaking now. We're very high in everything else in terms of speed of dissemination, permanence, organization, and whatnot. But what automation is going to allow us to do is to recreate that one-to-one human interaction at scale. We're at the point where, with artificial intelligence, with machine learning, we are replicating human thought and perception language. And at scale, that enables us to do some really cool things. And like I said, we're kind of reaching this ultimate point of everything converging. So in terms of evolution, we're running at an incredible pace because if I need to find some information, I just plug and play from an API, or I look something up on Google, I instantly find it. It's not like even 30, 40 years ago before computers were big, like we had the Dewey Decimal System in libraries, which helped us, but that was still, I had to go read the book. I had to go transfer the knowledge through some base. The internet, automation, all of these new technologies that we have going on are going to make us evolve at an incredibly fast rate that we sometimes struggle to wrap our minds around. So we look at a little bit of history of automation. This is where we'll step back a bit, start off with societal evolution. So again, going back to spoken word and kind of societal evolution as a whole, we had three major eras, one was the hunter-gatherer era, which lasted millions of years, somewhere around 6, 7, 8 million years, depending on where you get your source from. Then we had the agrarian era, where we had farming and sustenance, and that was about 8,000 years. And then more recently, we've been in the industrial era for only about 240 years. So even here, you can see the paradigms in societal and human evolution shrinking at an incredible rate, right? This growth curve. But even if you dive into the industrial era, you'll see that we first had the steam era, then electricity, and now we're in the computing era. The steam era took our mechanical abilities and accelerated them beyond anything we could have thought humanly possible. The artificial intelligence, machine learning is going to do that to our cognitive capabilities as well. And so if we see this, even within the computing era, things have broken down even more. We're now seeing paradigms where we went from personal computing to mobile computing to now we're entering this era of kind of ambient computing. The paradigms are switching every 5 to 6 years now. It's getting so short that we haven't really ever experienced this in our lifetime. And so when you feel like you're struggling to keep up with the pace of technology, you really are. It's not like it's not you. It's not your fault. Like everything's moving very, very fast. If you look at the curve of social development from this point, we kind of were flatlined for millions and millions of years until we hit the industrial era and things kind of took off, but not just like gradual. It hit an exponential curve, right? And if you look at examples of automation, within the past 220 years, from 1780 to 2000, we saw everything from the cotton gin to Google search. That's a pretty incredible pace of growth, right? Speed of evolution is like whoa, we didn't create anything near that in the past millions of years that we've been alive. However, if you look at even more modern, in the past 15 years, we've gone from a Google search to now I can speak to my devices. I have things driving me around. I have things that, like with Boston Dynamics, we're replicating human equilibrium. In 15 years, we've seen more than we saw in those 200 years. It's pretty incredible how fast these things are moving. And so we talked about data and how that plays a role, but we also have to consider now, since it's computing, things like Moore's Law. So growth factors include mass data collection, which we talked about, processing power and storage capacity, which is kind of Moore's Law, and algorithmic efficiency, which we'll get into with the law of accelerating returns. So Moore's Law, for those of you who don't know, which I'm assuming most of you do, talks about the increase in computing power and how it's doubling. It was doubling every year or two. The prediction was that it would go on for about 10 years, and unbeknownst to him, it has gone on for over 50 now, right? And so we saw chips that were less than 1,000 transistors per chip, and nowadays we're seeing up to 7.2 billion transistors per chip within that 50-year time span. Exponential growth, right? Things that he couldn't have predicted. And I always get the argument, like eventually this will hit an upper limit, and that's a fair argument. However, then we can get into parallel processing, right? Where it's not just like a single core processor, it's dual, it's quad core. We're still doubling the ability of work at this point. And even if that limits off, maybe we hit into nanotechnology. But for the sake of argument, we'll say that it does level off at some point, and then maybe there's no exponential growth. But actually, if you get into the law of accelerating returns, which has to do with algorithmic efficiency, the organization of information, as we were talking about earlier, when things are stored in a very, very efficient way, and we're able to access information, push and pull it, we can learn faster, we can transfer knowledge faster, we can create systems faster. We're creating systems on top of systems that are lightning fast, and that's why they're getting so fast we can't wrap our minds around. And there's no physical limit to the law of accelerating returns. It's a matter of math and organization. Right? So there's customized differences to that, right? The specificity of things. But there is no actual physical law against it like there is with Moore's Law. So we're entering this era where AI will be the new electricity that's embedded in everything, and data will be the new oil for those systems. So why conversation? If we look at human-computer interaction models over time, we started off with binary, right? Punch cards, ones and zeros, whatever you want to consider it to be. This was the beginning of computing, and it was not accessible to many, many people. Right? It was very technical. In the 60s and 70s, we got into command line interfaces, assembly languages. Gets a bit more human here, but still very technical at this point and not accessible to most of the world. But then in the late 70s and early 80s, we get into graphical computing, and this is where we see a mass consumer market that spawns, right? Because we're no longer having to learn the system's language. We're learning a system from a point-and-click interaction, right? So you don't have to code, you don't have to do this, and you can operate a computer. Once we got into the mobile computing era, we got into touch and gestures. So nowadays we can shake our phone to do things. We swipe, we pinch, we do all these other different actions that, from a design perspective, we call natural user interfaces, because it's getting more and more natural. But the progression and where it is headed is to voice and conversation. This is going to be the most intuitive interface in the history of computing, because we're no longer having to learn a computer language or a computer system. The computer is learning our language and our system. So we can just talk to it. A 2-year-old can talk to a computer. A 9-year-old man could talk to a computer. It's going to operate just as well for either. You don't have to be a technical expert to run it. Last year, Google search was 20% of them were in voice. 20% of Google's search results were from voice commands. And of that 20%, 12 were just within that year. So that's a pretty fast growth rate, right? 12% year over year is very quick. And if you look at the actual queries that are going into Google, over 70% of them are in natural language. So it's no longer commands to Google search. It is actual questions and natural language queries. People are slowly getting more used to this. Well, not even slow, very quickly getting more used to this. And as we get to this point where essentially back to one-to-one conversations, we have a thought and then we transfer it to this machine. It's the closest we're ever going to be to being plugged into a computer without it literally being plugged into us. That's why this will be the next interface. So now we'll kind of take a walk through designing conversation. I have written a lot of this in my book in pretty great depth, but because of time constraints, it's going to be pretty compressed. So if you're thinking through things and you have questions throughout this, please ask afterwards. I'm looking for feedback, and I want you to badger me. But we'll take a high-level understanding of this real quick. So first, how do we understand language? Language is essentially just a bunch of characters and symbols. Realistically, like, for example, this G is meaningless if you don't speak English or you don't know like what place it takes in this word. It's literally just a symbol. It's a line, a loop that comes down. And it means nothing besides the socialized value that we give to it. Right? And so how do we interpret a letter? Well, a letter we actually interpret based on the characteristics of that symbol. So we know an L based on its vertical drop down and its horizontal across. We know an E based on the cross section that matches with a loop that goes around. We recognize the patterns, right? We're pattern recognition systems. I can give you this, and you can take 26 letters and narrow it down to probably 5 or 6 is what I've gotten. Probably maybe 3 or 4 is more common, but I mean, I've gotten responses like, oh, that's a capital P, right? Which is kind of like you've thought that one through, but good for you. Then I give you this, and you're like, okay, I just took those, and I narrowed it down to probably 2. I give you this, and you're like, okay, now I know what it is, right? And after we recognize a character, we can then recognize it in any other pattern, and it means the same thing. Right? Same with if you think about like when you draw a smiley face with 2 dots and a line, that's actually just 2 dots and a line, but we've come to know that that is a smiley face, right? It's all symbols, it's all characters, and it's only meaning that we give from a socially constructed value. And so it changes across the world too. Language is not just something that we can pick up and define in a code base here in English and translate it to any other language. When we get to words are just a collection of those symbols put together. Sometimes white space in between, sometimes it's audible. But I can give you all of these, and you know what they say. But if I give you this, you just read it faster. Right? But that's the case, right? Like we recognize patterns. We see where these things go. We are pattern recognition systems, and that's why you can do this with a computer. Right? We love this so much that we even begin to guess sentences and stuff. Like we play games of crosswords. We play Hangman. We play Wheel of Fortune, where we start to guess sentences, right? Like it is a big thing in our culture. We love this thinking. Like it challenges our mind in a way that we love. We get to sentences. This is this is a breakdown from a linguistic standpoint of what a sentence actually is built of right here. Now, and I know some of you are looking at this and you're like, oh, that's such an easy equation. I could totally code that. But that's not the case, okay? It's very complex. It's language is what linguistic experts call a combinatorial technology. So with this equation, I can plug in anything that I want and create a sentence as long as it fills those roles, right? And in the English language alone, there are over 20 determiners, over 170,000 nouns in the English dictionary, and over 20,000 verbs. So think of the complexity there. If you actually do the math, there's over 46.2 quadrillion different ways you could make a 5-word sentence. And in the English language, the average sentence is 20 words long. Right? So that's a lot of complexity. There's a lot of things you have to guess. So when you're working with systems like Siri and Alexa and Google Assistant, and they kind of shit out on you, like they don't turn out really well, the results, like understand they are trying to answer every single question in the world, and they're not doing that bad of a job. Right? And we'll talk about personifying conversation. So with all of these these models that you end up building, people are going to attribute a personality to it. It is to your advantage to define that for them, right? And some people are like, oh no, it's a robot, it's a computer. No, that's what we do as humans. It's called anthropomorphizing, and I don't say it a lot because I can't say it very well. But also, like nobody knows what that means. It means to give a personality to an inanimate object. We do this to our cars. We do this to our pets. We do this to a lot of things, right? It's a human thing. We want to kind of find a connection. So it's best if we define that for them. Now, that doesn't mean to build a character every time. right? Like you don't need to build a Looney Tunes character for every bot you create, but there is always a personality to these systems. So how do we define voice? Voice can be defined through, in audio, pitch, range of your pitch, high and low, volume and speed of your context. And then in text and audio, it includes word choice, content choice, punctuation, grammar. Think of, for example, I don't have it, but if I say, oh dear, right, versus, oh dear, right, or I like point at something, I say, oh dear. That's three different things, but it's all the same sound. Right? If you see it in text format, it has different punctuation, it has different letters, but they only vary by maybe one letter at a time or one punctuation mark. It's not that easy to discern context. You can kind of tell where someone's from based on their words too, right? These are different words that, depending on where you live in the United States, probably tells like where you're from a bit, right? But depending on how you order a pop, I say pop. You can tell someone's emotions a bit, right? Probably someone's very happy versus someone who's probably pretty pissed. And you can tell gender. So it's a statistical fact that women are more likely to say sorry. Now that means either guys, we need to say sorry a lot more, or ladies, maybe don't apologize as much, right? But there are trends within gender, within socioeconomic status, within places we live that we can tell from voice. We are taught, like I have an English minor, we are taught to add voice to our creative writing, right? And it's through these types of things that we create different characters. You can also tell education level. So this is pulled this from Huckleberry Finn, classic novel that uneducated, right? You can see things like it weren't no harm versus there's no harm, things like that. Like we have a very, very set way of telling a lot of information about people by the way they talk, the way they write, the way they interact with each other. So how do we actually develop characters? One of the best ways that I try to tell people is to look at popular culture and understand like how TV characters were created or radio personalities were created, right? Also consider the fact that we're creating systems that are going to be in people's homes. They are, to an extent, going to be socializing us, right? Because especially children, as they're growing up and they're working with these systems, or speaking to an assistant, it is kind of a member of the family to them because they've grown up with it. So we have a responsibility to create diversity within these characters too. It doesn't necessarily have to be literal like a character from a movie or anything like that, but we need to show different aspects of the world. We can't just have complete generic. If we look at popular culture in the 90s, we saw Friends, we saw Seinfeld, we saw Everybody Loves Raymond. It paints a world of very white male patriarch. Right? We have to be mindful of what we do because that shapes people's realities. This is socialization through media. It's the same thing with these characters we create. This is people are going to adopt your personality, your language, your system, just like they do another human being. Nowadays we see shows like Modern Family, Blackish, and Jane the Virgin. This is very important. Just there are things that if you have questions afterwards we can talk about, but we need to be mindful as we're creating these systems, especially at scale, how they impact the world. So how do we actually design these conversations? This is a much more in-depth writing, but there's three main keys to designing a conversation. One is to initiate the conversation. One is to listen, which I think is where most conversational interactions fail nowadays. Maybe most people fail, is listening. And then third is to respond. So how do we initiate? Right now, we say things like, okay, Google. We have trigger words. I don't know that these will be around forever once people get used to conversational systems. But for now and for the immediate future, I think this is maybe the next SEO. There's only, like we talked about earlier, there's only so many ways you can say something in an audible format. Tumblr sounds like Tumblr with an E or Tumblr without an E. Right? Dig. Uber, a bunch of different things that we could say that like these trendy startup names that are spelt a little different doesn't mean a thing when it's audible. It's just a noise at that point. There's only one way to say it. Right? We have all these kinds of examples. Active listening. So as I mentioned, I think this is where a lot of these things fail. An ideal input for your system, if we're saying that we're going to book a flight, might be something like, I need a round-trip plane ticket from San Francisco, California to Honolulu, Hawaii for one adult from January 31st, 2017 to February 7th, 2017. And not a single one of you have ever spoken a sentence like that in your life, right? We say, I want to book a flight to Hawaii. Or even less, we might say, hey, I'm thinking about going to Hawaii. And then someone else says, oh, really? Where are you going? Right? Like, that's how conversations start. So we need to be able to listen and extract that data from the users. And how do we do that? So we might have, I want to book a flight to Hawaii. We ask them, oh, I can get you a flight to Hawaii, right? We tell them that we're listening, that we heard them. And then which island were you thinking? Right? So because there's actually 7 places you could go into Hawaii. So like we got to figure that out. Take these next steps. Don't ask them everything at once, but get gradual pieces as you go along. Also, consider the fact that most people don't type or speak all at once, like we just said. They speak in broken sentences. They speak in imperfect phrases. When they're texting, they say different bubbles at once, right? Like a lot of conversational bots nowadays, it'll take one input, it'll grab it, it'll interpret it, and it'll move on. People don't talk like that, though. So to have active listening as a conversational agent, you need to let people type and recognize their keystrokes. So if they type and then they go back to their keyboard, you can tell, right? Give them a second or two after an input. Let them continue typing if you notice those keystrokes are happening, if it's an event that you recognize. And then if they're done, if you've given them a second or two to finish up and they don't continue typing, grab all of this input, interpret that, and then respond. And as you're listening, throw up this symbol, right? Let them know that you're listening, that you're talking. Even as we have conversations with other human beings, it's not immediate. These people, even with page loads on internet, you give you a couple seconds. Like, it doesn't have to be perfectly immediate for them to be satisfied with your system. It just needs to respond appropriately, and that's the most important thing. So listen, let them say what they want, and then respond. And then with responding, so there's 3 main factors to this. This could be much more in depth as well, but it comes down to quantity, relevance, and clarity. Quantity has to do with the length of these, right? We have a lot of sites out nowadays with long marketing copy or pages of information we need to read about these things. Humans don't have conversations in long format, besides what I'm doing right now and which most people hate, which is like lecture format. We don't do long form. So you want to keep your copy to probably 250 characters or less. This is kind of back and forth. Think of it, you're volleying back and forth, and your conversation itself should direct it, kind of give them some bumper rails and respond appropriately so they kind of know what to say next. This is where you'll hear people say, okay, we need to pull in someone from improv or somebody who's written scripts. And that's a real thing. Don't be afraid to reach out to people like that because they have in their minds a lot of creative writing background. They understand how to guide a conversation. Relevance has to do with going all the way back with specificity and context. If I have someone screaming, coming up to me about how they saw someone just get hit by a car, and I'm looking at my phone and I say, oh man, I just got this pizza that's coming on the way. They're gonna be like, did you even hear me, right? Like they're gonna freak out a bit. Make sure that you're on topic when you're talking and that you're aligned, right? We speak in kind of conversational threads, so we'll talk on one topic and we'll talk through that topic and then we'll switch topics, right? It's what we call threading. Keep it relevant within that thread. And then lastly is clarity. So I write a lot. I've been writing for Envision, Global Design Publication, for a couple of years. I've done speaking engagements. Something I do to help with clarity, both within my reading or my writing, my speaking, and conversational agents, is to take the scripts I've written and say them out loud. More than likely, if you can't say it out loud very well, not a lot of people can. So make it easy. Don't consider it making it dumb. Make it accessible. Make it usable. And then what is the conversational design process? So this is something that resonates. I don't know how many of you are designers, actually? No? A couple, okay. Cool, nice. I'm not the only one. So it's pretty close to our design process as is now, just a little different. You still create a persona, just like modern design. You want to create a persona. The difference is that creating a persona is not it's a little more in depth. So, for example, creating a persona. This is going to be your new design style guide, essentially. Not fonts and colors and stuff. It is conversational persona. So you might create a persona for Batman that has his whole background, his level of pitch and volume and range and speed of his voice, right? So that people know, like, this is how Batman speaks. You might have samples of what Batman might say, maybe different conversational pieces, like how Batman would react when he's running against, trying to fight Joker versus Spider-Man, right, or something like that. And these sets the tone so that when you hand it off to the next person who's building this, they know where to go from there. It's not just like, oh, I think I know what Batman talks like. I'll make this. This is easy. No, we have a standard for our team. We create it and we hand it down. New employees, handing off to other teams, consultancies, whatever it is. This is that guide. Then we write. And the key to writing, so writing's tough for everyone. No one really likes writing. I mean, I do, but I'm a weirdo. Writing is something where people get, I think, a lot of times get kind of a fear about, like, I don't know what to write. I might not write the right thing. Like, don't worry about that. Step 2 is write and just let it flow. I always try to tell people, take one thread of a conversation and focus that at once, but go wide. Like, write a bunch of different examples. Don't stress it. Write in long form. Do whatever feels right. Just get the ideas out of your head and on paper. Because then the next step is to condense. So after you've thought it, like you've let it out, then think it through and condense it. Don't try to be perfect on the first run, because nobody's going to be. Don't worry about it. The next is prototype, and this is like, I think everyone is always asking, like, how do I prototype these things? I need to build a bot, and I need to code this up. Is there a template service I can use? I'll tell you the best way to prototype a conversation, and this might blow your mind, the best way to prototype a conversation is to just have the conversation. Just go talk to someone, like have some note cards made up, hand them the user cards, you hold the conversational agent cards, and just play a game of charades. Like, similar to design where we sketch our ideas first, right? We don't want to go into full code. That's going to take us time. It's going to take us a lot of time. It's going to waste money. Do it on pencil and paper first. Get it really rough, refine it a few times, then take it into a template or into code, and then test it out on people at scale. Right? Next is to build. So we've prototyped it. Now we can, like I said, begin to build it in code or a template, depending on what you're looking for. I will say that I think templates are kind of like creating a really high fidelity prototype. So if you go to like ChatFuel or Motion.ai, things like that, it's not quite full conversation. It's a logic tree, which conversation is not logical. It is organic, and it's very hard to replicate through a system like that. It's good for prototyping. You can hack it to make it feel pretty good, but at the end of the day, it's not dynamic. Then you think of like platforms you can put it on with WeChat and Messenger and all these things. It's going to depend on the audience you're trying to find. It's also something to think about versus building within your app. If we build an app, we have to build for different platforms. If we build it within the web, we have to build for different browsers. If you build it into like Messenger or WeChat, they handle all that for you. So you build it once, and they do that scaling. So there's a bit of that too, right? Depending on, those are just pros and cons to weigh out. I'm not telling you which one to go with, but things to think about. Right? And then iterate. So something that I think a lot of people haven't quite realized yet with conversations that, as we saw in the beginning, conversation is quite vast, the amount of words that are in our language and the things you can say. So you're not going to nail it on the first time. Nobody is. And the key here is that you need to get data flowing through it to understand what your users are going to say to you and how to change that conversation. So unlike traditional applications where you might have launch and release and you might kind of update it every 6 months or something, you're going to be kind of in a perpetual iteration state for maybe a few months or a year more, depending on like how much data you're getting in and how fast it's coming. But that's kind of the way it's going to work now because of the way conversation happens. And then, so we'll take a step back. Now we know kind of how to design a conversation. Where do they play a role in these systems? Because obviously, we're not going to get rid of screens in the future. There's still going to be interactions that are not conversational based. I might have a trigger that I talk to this system conversationally, and then it sends me a picture or something I need to see. I might have confirmations that are gestural or touch. They're not going to go away. However, conversation, I think, will play a very large role in these systems. And the trouble is figuring out where, right? Because in any computer system, it is an input into some kind of program that operates and understands it and then puts an output, right? The problem nowadays is that we have 7 billion devices connected to the internet, and by 2020 it will be over 50 billion. That's the prediction. So it could just be anywhere. And like, where do I put this stuff? How do I connect it in a meaningful way? Conversation plays a great role for like top of mind answers or things that are easy to speak about, right? You probably don't want to have a conversation out of the blue about someone's tax returns. Right? Like, maybe they need to pull up some financial documents, or like there's something else they need to that. So consider what kind of conversation you're having and help them set that stuff up. It's not that you can't have that as a conversation, but you just need to make sure they're prepared for it. Versus like, if I just tell my assistant to call me an Uber, that's like really easy, right? Top of mind kind of responses. Sometimes things are just easier to say. We've all had the conversations at work on Slack or through email or even text messages with our friends where it's just easier to pick up the phone or to go talk to them at their desk, right? This is where conversation, it's nice because it can come in and instead of like pushing buttons or trying to text things, it's just voice, and it's something that it's just easier to say. And then lastly, when you need to be hands-free. So there's plenty of times, whether we're cooking in the house, whether we're outside, playing with the kids or doing something, whether we're kayaking, whatever you're doing, you just want to be hands-free. You don't want to be glued to a screen anymore. Conversation is a great way to get people away from that and let them live more meaningful lives. So that's kind of an overview of the design aspect of it and how it plays a role in systems. Now let's take some time to consider where these automated systems can go in the future, how it can play out. And I do this because I think it's important for us to consider the long-term impacts. I think a lot of books on design or technical even is focused on how to do things and not so much the impact that we create. And so I like to take time to walk through where, both the good and bad, just to understand how things could play out. In terms of good future, I mean, automation, the era of ambient technology, could create safer, more inclusive, and more meaningful lives for all of us. In terms of safety, we can turn to something like Tesla. A lot of people don't think of the scale of, I'm sure most of you do because you're data folks. But in general, like sometimes the crowds I think about, they don't quite understand machine learning or why a self-driving car may be safer. If you consider that the average person drives 12,000 miles a year, and we'll say they drive for 60 years in their lifetime, that's 720,000 miles in their lifetime they will drive. And just for easy math, we'll round it up to 1 million. We'll say they drive a lot. Tesla, in 15 years that they've been around, have already driven over 3 billion miles collectively through crowdsourced knowledge, right? Because the way that works. And so in 15 years, they've already have more collective driving experience, 3,000 times more collective driving experience than any human being will have in their entire life. So it is a matter of safety at a certain point with these systems. We also see systems like medical devices where doctors predicting cancer have an error rate of 3.5%. The machine might have 7.5%, but then together they have a statistical rate of 0.5%. Right? So humans and computers working together, an amplification of our intelligence is awesome. It can create really great results. This here is, for those of you who don't know what this is Nadia from Soul Machines. So Soul Machines is working with the National Disability Insurance Services of New Zealand. And what's happening here is a lot of these people that work through the disability insurance system, they have trouble because they might have attention disorders, they might have hearing disorders, things that make it hard to work with a phone operator. And what this does is, for those who can't hear well, it prints off the words for them in a conversational way. This avatar actually is rendered by the guy who made King Kong in Avatar in the movies. So it's very, very high fidelity render of a human being, and it moves. Excuse me. They've taken data points of human faces over time and created an emotional system that can speak, react, and look and kind of be human. So in that sense, someone who has a hearing problem can read the thing's lips. It makes it a little bit easier when you can actually read someone's lips, hear the audio together. And then up top, you can see the cameras. These cameras monitor the faces of these users so they can see like when this person's getting agitated with the system or bored, or sometimes people just fall asleep because they maybe are narcoleptic or something. Yeah, so this is making technology more accessible, though, right? To people that have trouble with computing, it's easier for them to use if we can do that. Right? We're at the point where technology can kind of be a form of leadership at this point, where we're replicating more intimate details of life. And then lastly, it can be more meaningful, just in the sense where we don't have to be connected to a screen all the time, right? We all have seen at the dinner table when someone's in their phone and they're literally not there with us, right? They're physically there, but they don't know what's going on. They're in their phone, right? We could create a future where we disconnect people from that. We kind of get people back to more human interaction, let them live their lives more freely. But also, we need to consider how it could go poorly, because these systems are scaling the globe. There's more data in some of these companies than in federal intelligence agencies, and they are publicly traded companies, right? Things can go wrong at scale, especially if they're not considered. Can create skewed perceptions of the world, can create systemic biases through data that is interpreted poorly, and it can lead to job loss. Talk about skewed perception first. We'll kind of reflect on news media. Traditional news media, there was not too many news stations on TV in the 60s and 70s compared to what there is now. There was many fewer news publications, magazines in print. So when it comes to news, there was a general bell curve to the knowledge that society had. Whether you were progressive or liberal, you generally had about the same information to make decisions and understand the world. It's information again, right? Very back to the beginning. However, nowadays, we have the internet, we have social media. Over 60% of people get their news from social media. And in the attention economy that we're living in, where revenue is built off ad-based, so clicks and engagement, as opposed to actual quality of the news sources, we've created this complete opposite realm where we're living in filter bubbles, where everything that we like is fed to us. If I refresh my feed, it's different than what it was before I refreshed it. These algorithms are feeding us news very specific to us and constantly changing at a rate in order to make us engage with it more, to stick to a screen. This is essentially algorithmic entertainment. However, this is affecting our perception of the world. When we're in the internet 6 hours a day, right, like I just said, we're on a screen. That's what we see. That is our reality. And even if it gets so popular that it goes beyond social media, it gets put into TV broadcast. It gets printed in a newspaper and things like that from a tweet. The internet has no limits nowadays, and this is the news. And when people are in separate polar opposite spectrums, they can't communicate. It's not that they don't understand each other. It's that is their perception of the world. We talk about systemic biases. So I ask crowds, if you were to create an algorithm that assesses someone's creditworthiness, would you ask them for their race? And most people look at me funny, or they say no, and that's good, because that would be racist. However, would you ask for their zip code or information about where they live? Most people would, right? But if you know Portland, you know this area of town. I don't know this area of town, but I looked up a sector, or I looked up some information from a private mapping company, and they said this is the social security set, poor area of town. Is that right? You can tell a lot about people from their zip code, whether that's race, whether that's income, socioeconomic status, level of education, crime, all this stuff. So what seems to be benign variable can become malignant if it's not interpreted in the right way. If you consider what a credit score goes on to do, that affects our ability to get jobs. That affects our ability to get a loan for a home or an education. It also affects our ability to get good insurance rates and many other things from a simple credit score algorithm that then spreads in a systemic way, creates biases where in the 60s and 70s you may have experience blatant racism or blatant sexism, but at least you could go up and apply to the humanity of that gatekeeper. An algorithm is black and white, and it cuts you before you even see a human being. So there is danger in these systems if we're not fully thinking through the data points we're pulling in and how they're interpreted. I believe that these systems are created with the best intentions, but when they're not built with teams that are diverse, sometimes those best intentions get biased. And then lastly is employment. If you look at the GDP versus the employment to population ratio from 1995 to 2011, by the way, employment to population ratio is the amount of people employed that are of employable age. You see that through the 90s, it was pretty steady. We had a slight recession in the late 90s where both of them dropped. They recovered. However, you see in the early 2000s that the internet really starts to take off. Automation starts to kick in, right? GDP starts to plummet or skyrocket because of this, right? Don't need as many people working, so you don't see the workforce grow with it. Kind of stay steady. It's hard to lay off thousands of people at once just because you're making more money and you see a computer that can take over jobs. However, the Great Recession hits. We see both of them plummet. If we watch afterwards, the GDP grows because automation is taking over and these systems are doing the work, but the employment rate stays down and in fact kind of drops a little bit. Because what that did is that allowed corporate CEOs to lay off thousands of people at once, right? It was where in here, it's hard to lay those people off. It's no matter how cynical you are, it's hard to lay off thousands of people and say, we don't need you because we have this machine to do the work. With the recession, it was, we actually don't have the money and we need to let you go, and it's more understandable, but then we don't need you back either. Right? It's not a matter of if these things will start taking jobs from people. It's when and at what scale and for how long. We, as the people building these systems, need to understand the impact that we're creating. I'm not telling any of you to shut down your systems by any means, but think of it and try to think of how we can help people bridge this gap that is going to come. Because when there's disparity in wealth at the scale that we're seeing, that's why we're seeing elections like we had last year in the United States. That's why we're seeing elections like Brexit in London, where people are pushing for traditional values. They don't understand what's happening, so it's a fear. It's a completely rational fear where they can't afford to feed their families, to have homes, to have health insurance. And we can help them bridge that gap. So take time to help them. This is one example, too, though, of a bot that's taking over. This is Coin from JP Morgan. Last year, it displaced 360,000 hours worth of technical legal document interpretation. So this is, lawyers getting paid $300,000, $400,000, $500,000 a year. It displaced 360,000 hours worth in the first year of just trial. And so, again, it's going to happen. It's just when and at what scale. So, how do we move forward? Create an inclusive future that's really good. Because of all people, I know that sounded cynical, but I'm very optimistic about this, and I have a lot of hope. It requires work from us that are creating it. Step one is to improve education. Not only STEM, but in the humanities. Things that computers can't automate are things that are empathetic, that are creative, that are non-routine. Non-routine, you get there eventually, but for the most part, right? We need to have diversity in our education, not just STEM and people going into computer science, although we do need an increase in that. We need it in general in humanities and in jobs like even plumbing and different simple jobs that we don't think about aren't going to get automated that fast. Skilled labor. Increase data literacy. So again, I'm not going back telling you to give your IPs away at all, but as community members, we need to speak to other people in the community and educate them about what's happening enough that they understand it, right? Enough that they are not terrified of what's happening, to instill a belief that this will go well. And when it comes time to vote, they know how to vote. They know how to talk about this stuff, at least intelligently. Equal opportunity by design. So we talked a bit about what can happen when you don't have a diverse team around you. We hire engineers, we hire designers for their years of experience in the field and their background. When we're going to replicate cultures and languages and different parts of human culture, we should hire people that have life experience in that area, right? Like hire a diverse team if you're going to build for a diverse system. Discover and accelerate emerging markets. So There is a lot of business. We've seen, Amazon, Google, all these companies kind of eating up smaller businesses. That's fine. That's part of a capitalist market. However, there is domain knowledge in local areas that we in Silicon Valley and Portland and wherever you are don't understand. There are problems in Africa that we wouldn't understand unless we went there. There are problems in China that we wouldn't understand unless we went there, right? It's good for markets to have competition. Be willing to help educate people. If they reach out to you and you're doing something really cool, take some time to respond to their email. If you know investors that maybe are looking for other people and you know people that need help finding investment, like help them find investors. Just use the network that you have to help these emerging markets grow. Because that's one of the key factors that kills an emerging market is when they don't have access to technical resources like we do here in Portland or in San Francisco, in New York, and London, these bigger tech hubs. Right? A lot of emerging markets can die off quickly because they don't have those resources and it's hard to get access to them. Next is regulate automation. So this is one where, especially at bigger tech companies, it gets a little itchy sometimes. I'm not here to shut down companies, but if we walk through regulation, it's probably going to end up in one of three different ways. That is either unregulated, where it gets dangerous because we're working with, like I said earlier, scales of data that are global and are at a level that is technically relegated to CIA, FBI type data, but it's in a capitalistic pursuit. It's not a government regulation thing. So that could get dangerous. We have the second option of people are terrified because we don't participate in our communities, we don't educate people. They're terrified and they stifle our innovation, in which innovation goes to another country, which can be maybe more dangerous. Or we have a third option where we participate in our communities. We help educate people. We make sure they know enough that when it comes time to vote, we create regulation that helps our population and enable us to innovate and be the leaders in this field around the world. And that's what I'm hoping, is that we are all educated. We know what's happening. We can kind of see the future. That's why we're working on these things. Just help people, help them understand how we can move forward. Right? And in terms of automation taking jobs and whatnot, if you take jobs, you take away income tax, you take away taxes on goods, tolls on roads, everything, and you lose a lot of money for infrastructure. So we'll probably also need to tax automation at a certain point. And what that can do is then fuel universal basic resources. So healthcare, education especially, and maybe income. Although I'll be honest with you, I don't necessarily believe in universal basic income. I've done a lot of research, I've talked to a lot of experts, and read a lot of government reports from the Obama administration. The best suggestion I've heard from most people is a negative income tax. Because if you have universal basic income, you're actually giving money to everyone, which includes the super wealthy. Versus a negative income tax where maybe these people don't have jobs. And so from the automation, we take that tax, we create government initiatives, employ people, and pay them with this reverse income tax. Right? So it's just one option. That's things that I've read. But understand that this is probably something we're going to have to consider and approach at a certain point. And there are plenty of people that are doing research on this. Y Combinator, different places in the UK are testing this stuff out. That's it. That's all I got. So open to questions. Again, I came here to lay this out so that we have a better perspective on tech. That's kind of my goal with this book, is help you understand why we're at this point in history, how to build an amazing system, because I believe there's going to be some really cool shit made, and I hope that it is. But again, I also want everyone to understand the perspective of where this can go and how we have an impact on this. Right? We are the people building this, setting the foundations now that will be the products later on. And just take that with responsibility. That's all I'm really here to ask and to inform. Participate in your communities, help people understand. And when someone is vehemently against you or negative towards you for what you're doing, if that happens, right? I'm from Nebraska, so I experienced a lot of this when I go home, right? I'm very liberal, but it's a very conservative state. I don't return with spite. I listen to them and I help them understand what I see. I try to make an impact on their lives because yelling at each other gets us nowhere. And we're at a point in time in our country where we need some love, some faith. So have some empathy and help people understand this stuff. Participate in your communities. That's my larger message. But thank you. That's all I got. Any questions? Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. Yes. So the question, if you couldn't hear, is like, will essentially this be the next UI for computers, or will there not be like a UI? Like I said, I still think screens are going to be around. I think the goal and how we should picture this and how we frame it, and that I've talked with a lot of experts at Google, people that are. I'm actually very beginning. I'm working pretty hand in hand with Nandini Stocker, who's head of voice design at Google. We're not trying to eliminate screens, and UI probably won't go away for a long time, but there's a lot that we don't need to see a screen. We don't need to see a screen to like turn on our microwave, to like respond to a tweet, to like do all these things. We could just speak to our machine. There's a lot of different ways that we could do this. So no, I don't think UI will go away. I think what we're hoping for, and why I'm doing this, is to help people understand that we could have a more meaningful future where we're not connected to screens so much, because it is damaging psychologically to people to be in screens 6, 7, 8 hours a day. It affects our sleep. It affects our ability to have meaningful interactions with the world. And if we can create systems where we don't need to be glued so much, but still have the same engagement rates, still have all this stuff that we need as product developers and designers and businesses, I think that's a step that we should make. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Yep. Yeah. 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 That's a great question. So conversation generally is, like you said, organic. It is not a linear thing. Um, that's a matter of, in the last step there where I had iteration, you're kind of generally, most of these systems are probably going to start off pretty logical, logic tree type based. And then you need to get it out and used by people. Even Google Assistant, like the beginnings of Google were Google Search. It's taken them 19 years to get to the point that they're at, right? That's a lot of data. That's a lot of time. There's systems nowadays, things like API.ai, Wit.ai, Maya.ai, a bunch of different technical frameworks that you could pick up that help you. Like API.ai, which was purchased by Google, actually has domains, so you don't have to code all this stuff. You can code the base of the conversations, and then you can plug in like modules for small talk or modules for scheduling things, and it kind of does those for you. I think there's huge opportunity in language generation. I think that's one of the biggest struggles in creating language systems right now is when you talk to me, you're not going to get the same answer, like the same words come out of my mouth. If you ask me the same question, I'll probably answer it differently, right? But a lot of these conversational systems, because they're logic trees, they have one response, right? And so I was working with a Google developer that's a really good friend of mine. He's working on a system, and he won't care if I say this because it's open source. But so the idea is that maybe you have 20 different responses, right? And each time it randomly selects one response, and it gets down to the last one. And then in order to not repeat, it doesn't have, so you can't say that option, right? So if you went from 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, then on the next one, it wouldn't say 1. It would only say the other ones. So you never get a repeated answer. Feels more human. There are hacks to it. There is no perfect way right now, I don't believe. I believe we're in the Walkman era of conversation design. And pretty soon we will reach the iPod where everything's magical. But we're not, I think, 3 to 5 years. what? Meta observation. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, you even have like choose your own adventure storybooks, things like that, right? Like it's yeah, you're yeah, 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 yep. Hmm. Yeah, yeah. I think a lot of people are still trying to figure that out. To be completely honest with you, like I said, I think it has time to evolve, and I think figuring out how to generate language is probably the big money spot right now. That's my theory. Yeah. 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 You want-
You said that now we're writing apps, trees, but we don't have.
You also, I mean, something similar. If you think of like AR and VR, for the longest time we had mapping that was outside in, and now we're working on inside out. Same with conversation. We're still in that outside in world. I don't know that anyone's broken into the inside out, and that's why I'm saying I think language generation will be huge if we can figure that out. Good question. So I've read a lot of theoretical stuff on this. It's hard to it's hard to put a label on that. Most people say that once we reach the point where these things can predict the future, that's kind of like the sentient in our human. A lot of behaviors we do are mechanical. If we say, eating is a human thing, no, plants do it. Are plants human? Are plants sentient? It's up to you. But then it comes to machines too, and typically like that one point is they conclude that it's like the ability to predict the future and like have estimations. Um, and that's a big rabbit hole that I don't know if I can completely go down myself. I don't think I'm that good at it. Yeah, you're right. There's got to be some point where we have to talk about that stuff in more depth for sure. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Right. Yeah. I'm gonna say yes, and that's about as deep as I can get for that one. But yeah, I'm gonna say yes. I think that, uh, especially, so that's why I talk about the capitalistic drive behind all this stuff. If we're pushing, the idea of capitalism is to one up, right? It's not even keeping up with the Joneses, it's going beyond the Joneses. You create systems that you are unaware that you're creating, right? Like Facebook has open sourced the ability to negotiate. That's a little dangerous, right? You could create something that long term persuades people, right? That's a negotiation. What if the computer can persuade us enough to create its own system on the back end and not have us see it? Things like that. There's plenty of these conversations, right? Yes, that's kind of my answer. Yeah, first. Mm-hmm. 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 So going to the Turing test analogy, I think. Oh, yeah, yep. So question. Tell me if I'm wrong. Um, has a computer passed it, or will we pass the Turing test, kind of? And like, what would I want to work on after that? Yeah, 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 yeah. So in terms of the Turing test and passing the Turing test, I think that, and I've read a lot about this, I think that I think we have passed the Turing test if you look at the 50s and what the standards were, right, and what they actually set it up to be. But because we slowly adapt to these things over time and we grow up with more advanced systems than they did, we still can tell the difference between what is now, what wouldn't pass, and what back then, if we took Assistant from Google and gave it to them, they'd be like, oh shit, this is real, right? There's a difference, right? Like in perception because of what we grow up through. So it's a difference in perception. And in that sense, I don't know that we ever will fully pass a Turing test. There is that. Beyond conversation, let me pull it up real quick. I'll show you something I'm really interested in that I've talked to some people about. Actually, that Nadia that I showed as an example. Let's do this. So like, and that's a pretty photoreal, right? Pretty real thing. I'm pretty interested in what they're doing. I think so. What they're trying to do is I forget the words they say exactly, but they're trying to create like a digital molecules or like DNA in the sense that like we'll be able to quickly do this and create our own faces in human models. And I think next step beyond conversation is creating full replications. And then you get into the question of where do we have sentience and how do we play with that stuff. I think that's quite a bit down the road. But yeah, that would be, I guess, my guess. Yeah. Question? Yeah. Yes. Yes. Mhm. Yeah. Yeah. I think you're right. First of all, if you don't have mass scales of data like Google or Amazon or something, it is very tough to get these things off the ground. So first, I mean, understand, and you understand this, but in general, understand that there are a lot of people that like to see the world burn. They're gonna say some shit that like you don't expect, and you don't need to predict that stuff. There's a limit to like what you create. So have a focus and make sure that your bot can respond to your focus first and foremost. Worry about the other extra stuff later. Um, let's see, how do you manage process and stuff? I mean, it's really a matter of testing. And like I said with the beta testing, like with note cards and stuff, that's the quickest way to iterate internally. And then you just got to get it out to the world and slowly, I mean, it's just like a longer extension of a beta release essentially, but you need people to jam at the system and to like break it. And it's frustrating, but it's good. Yeah. 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 Mhm. Between the two models you're talking about. So I think going back to kind of creating a character, also there's the difference between creating like an actual character that is entertaining or like has a strong like declarative personality versus creating like assistant, who a lot of people say, oh, Google doesn't have a personality. Um, it doesn't have a character, but it does have a personality, right? But it is a tool, and that is its personality, right? So the difference between an entertainment bot or conversation agent versus a service agent. I think in terms of success rate, it depends on the use case, right? Like Call of Duty had a conversational bot a couple of years ago, I think it was. And I should know the name of the actual person from the game. I don't play a lot of video games, but it was like the sergeant or the person on the cover essentially was the person they could talk to. So it got people really excited. It helped them unlock levels in the game and stuff like that. It went over really well because it fit their brand. That's key. Fit their brand, and it fit their target goal, their focus, right? I think when we try to create these conversational agents that can do everything in the world, that's where they fail. Start with a focus and make sure you have a stronghold on that focus. So in that persona or in whatever you're creating that is your foundation, make sure your team knows your focus, because everyone wants to be able to answer everything and have that ultimate conversation bot, but as you've seen, and most of you who haven't created these yet but will see, it's very hard to wrap around in the entire world of language. And so have a focus, and if they go out of bounds, create systems that pulls them back in a funny manner. If you work through or not necessarily funny, but like an engaging manner. If you work with like Poncho and you cuss at Poncho or something, they'll be like, hey, that wasn't very nice. Like you should say something a little nicer next time. Or like if they say something that's close to what you're looking for, try to understand it and be like, oh, this is what I heard, but did you mean this? Like try to redirect the conversation. Something Nandini talks about a lot is there are no errors in conversation. So as like technical, we think through, okay, this is an error state. But actually in conversation, whether I'm talking to any of you, there is no errors in our conversation. You may mishear me. I may say the wrong word, but we do what's called repairing. That's part of responding that I couldn't cover in full conversation. But we do repairing, where we respond in a manner where we try to fix that. We're like, what did you say? Or I misunderstood you. At a certain point, that gets annoying to people. After 2 or 3 tries, you kind of got to like hand it off to a human being probably for service. That's what we call a handoff typically. But yeah, it does get frustrating. You're right. And those are probably the best ways I could say is handle is focus on repairing the conversation, figure out when to hand it off to a human, have focus, and create a very strong core of what you're doing that will drive the mission forward. Beta test a lot, early and often. Yeah. Right. And you've seen things like Microsoft Tay that took off and were very nasty. Yeah. Good question. It's a tricky one. Depends on your data source, right? There are people that are working on creating open source databases. Mozilla is working on a language open source for all language. There's OpenAI. I don't know if you've heard of that. OpenAI is who I think Y Combinator started it up with Elon Musk. It's like they're trying to democratize data because I don't know how many of you keep up with the news, but Elon is pretty terrified of AI, and there's a good reason for that, right? So he wants to create open source data so that it's democratized, and that's how it should be. So you'll have systems like those that come out. We're still in a very young era of this, but because of the speed we're evolving, it can get dangerous really quickly, and because of the scale of information too. I would say though, in general, beyond just the data set itself, if you're beta testing, things like that, be conscious of who you pull in. So we have curated blogs, we have curated websites. There's no harm in curating the beginning of your knowledge base and creating a system that has the focus of what you want. There's no harm in that, as long as it's thought through, built with a diverse team, has impact built into it. So that's probably my best suggestion. That's a tough one. That's a very tough one because, data, especially at scale, the internet's kind of a cesspool sometimes. Way in the back, sorry. Yeah. Hold on. I can't quite hear you fully. I'm going to come back. Sorry. I got part of it, but I was like, no, I need to get closer. Yeah. 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 Um, so I probably can't give you a defined answer for that fully. I'm still trying to work that out myself. But that's where regulation comes in my opinion. So if you didn't hear the question, it's like, how do we build collaborative ecosystems? How do we create an inclusive future with like the limited data? How do we make sure people are pushing for best practices and not just pushing for capitalistic pursuits? I think if it's unregulated, if it's free and open as it is right now, and you have these disparities in data between companies like Amazon, Google, Apple, it's very tough to do that. That's more or less why I'm pushing for regulation. It's not a matter of I want to stifle innovation or that we need to stop this stuff. It's a matter of we've seen how dangerous it can get, and those were real things that are happening now. If we don't stop it, the rate that we're growing, it's only going to get exponentially worse, exponentially faster. The regulation is more about just creating a safe environment because these can be really incredible for us. And so I think we need regulation that helps with collaboration. And it's kind of like peace treaties with nuclear warfare. We need to have treaties among countries, among local communities that talk about how we collaborate. So yeah, I can't give you a defined answer to exactly how that plays out. I'm still trying to talk to policymakers myself and figure this out. I think a lot of people are, but that's kind of where I push for that. Hold on, yeah. Yeah. People that keep their promise. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. It's important. Yeah. 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 Yep. Yeah. Yep. Yeah. In the book, I do have a lot of case studies. You're right. Yeah. It was a matter of like I have 40, and it's a plus page book. So, but yeah, you're right. I mean, there's this mental attitude in Silicon Valley, I think in tech in general, it's move fast, break things. That doesn't work when we're messing with people's lives and replicating culture, human thought perception. We need to be more mindful. It gets dangerous real quick. And yeah, you're right. And so I will have examples of things like that. I'm reading a lot about systems thinking and how systems go wrong at meta scale. And again, like some of this stuff it's undefinable 100%, but I think you're right. By looking through examples of how things have played out in the past, we can learn from that. And that's again why I took the time to walk through the history so people could understand the growth rate. And I take the time to walk through the future because I think a big issue, like I said in the beginning, with whether it's a technical code book or a design book in general, is focused on how to do it, not why we're doing it this way and the impact long term. And so I'm trying to kind of change that a bit. Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. 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 Mm-hmm. yeah. Yeah, and so first, thank you for the suggestion. Thank you for saying that. I did get suggested that book actually from a Stanford student who is has worked with Ford and Waymo and different companies on self-driving, because that's a huge thing for self-driving cars, right? To have some ethics built in. So yeah, it is. If you're looking for that, good book. I haven't read it yet, but it's on my list for sure. And yeah, I completely agree on the different ways of regulation can play out, and they can go good and bad. And there's no guarantee that even if you set it up, it goes good, right? Even if you set it up well. But going back, so like I talk about designing with diversity. That's not just race or sex. That includes diversity of education. Like you're saying, like you might be very, very good at engineering, but someone else is good at the systems thinking. And that's why we have teams. That's why we build teams. Like build a diverse team, whether that's race, gender, ethnicity, education. Like hire people that are going to tell you no. Hire people that are going to be opposite of what you're thinking, because that's how you're going to create the best systems. And I go into much more depth in that in my book. And at the same time, I'm doing these talks so that we have conversations like that. Like this isn't to scare people. This isn't to like set a death trend, but to open up the thoughts and to start conversations. Because I know that I can't do this myself, no matter how much I'm touring right now. I was up in Washington. I'm going down the coast all the way, LA into Texas, up into the Midwest. I'm from Omaha, so I'm going to spend some time working with startups in Nebraska. And then I'm going to Brazil and different countries. I want to start this conversation globally. I think that it has to be kind of a grassroots thing. It can't be shoved on people. And that's why I'm asking that you're active participants in your community, that you know more about what's going on now after hearing this. Just have a heads up and be empathetic with people. And let's make something really awesome. So, any other questions? Yeah. Uh-huh. Yeah. So I can't get into all the details, but I will tell you that is a big part of why I'm doing this. Why I'm not feared, not fear, but when you're working for Google, there's a lot of pressure from a monetary aspect. There are projects that are worth billions and billions a month. Right? When you have that kind of stress, sometimes you don't think about the big term. You're more focused on like, oh my God, I can't mess up. I need to get this out the door. It needs to be perfect. And we're localizing across the globe. People are heads down a lot of times. I think that higher ups have thought through a lot of this stuff. And I think that there are ground level people that are thinking through this, but at scale, I can't say that 100% of them are. And that's why I'm doing this. I don't think any six-figure salary is worth the implications of what could happen. And so that's kind of, yeah. Any other questions? No? Cool. Well, thank you for having me. Shameless plug. Thank you. Thank you. Shameless plug. If you want to get on the wait list, designingintelligence.com. You can find it. I was really surprised that I could get that domain too. Like, shit, that's lucky. But yeah, thank you. Thank you for everything, and I hope that you guys do really cool shit. And if you need me, feel free to reach out wherever. I'll send this to him, and he'll send it out to you. So yeah, cool. Thank you. Good night.
Feel free to keep the conversation going at Upper Lip in person or also on our Slack channel, pdxdata.org/Slack. You can add your email and name and get an invite to our page. We have channels for different languages, different topics. Jump in there if you want. Thank you.